November 4, 2025, investigators opened a grave in Chimong County, New York. The man buried there had been dead for more than 20 years. His name was Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. He had been a Korean War veteran, a husband, a father of 4, and until this point, there was no public indication that investigators had ever considered him a suspect in the murder of a 12-year-old girl. But they weren't opening his grave because of something that had happened in 2004. They were there because of something that had happened 61 years earlier. In March 1964, Mary Theresa Simpson disappeared from Elmira, New York. 4 days later, her body was found in a wooded area near Combs Hill Road. She was 12 years old. Investigators collected evidence from the crime, and somehow, part of that evidence survived for more than 6 decades. What they eventually recovered from it was almost impossibly small. Just a tiny amount of DNA, but it was enough to give investigators something they had never had before. A genetic profile from the man they believed had killed Mary. There was just one problem: they didn't know who he was. The DNA had been tested before. A profile had been developed and searched against law enforcement databases, but no match was found. It was tested again in 2014, still nothing. The case remained unsolved. Then investigators tried a different approach. Instead of looking for the killer himself, they looked for his relatives. That search eventually led them to a family. And from that family, investigators began focusing on a man who had been dead since 2004. Alfred Murray. But a family connection was not enough. Investigators needed to know whether Murray himself was the source of the DNA. So they obtained a DNA sample from one of his sons. The result gave investigators the connection they needed. Murray was now their focus. But there was still one final step. They needed his DNA. And because he was dead, that meant opening his grave. That is why, on November 4, 2025, investigators went into a cemetery in Chimong County and exhumed Alfred Murray's remains. The evidence collected in 1964 had survived. The science had caught up with it, and after 61 years, investigators were finally able to compare the DNA from Mary's case directly with DNA from the man they believed was responsible. But the grave is not where this story begins. It begins on a Sunday evening in March 1964, with a 12-year-old girl who was simply trying to get home. Mary Theresa Simpson was born in Elmira, New York, in either 1951 or 1952. She was the daughter of Ellsworth and Rose Simpson. She had an older brother, an older sister named Linda, and an older half-brother. In May 1963, Mary's parents separated. She went to live with her father. Later that year, Mary and her father moved to Hammondsport, a small town in Steuben County, after he found work there. The move changed how often Mary saw her mother. Instead of seeing her regularly, she was seeing her about once a month. Then, in early March 1964, her father found a new job back in Elmira. They moved home. Mary was 12 years old. And less than 2 weeks later, she disappeared. It was Sunday, March 15, 1964. That afternoon, Mary left her father's apartment at about 3 o'clock. She told him she was going to visit her cousin. She did go to her cousin's house. But before that, she made another stop. She went to see her mother. Mary stayed there for about an hour. Then she continued to her cousin's house, where she spent part of the evening with her cousin and an aunt. By about 6:30, Mary was leaving. A short time later, around 7 p.m., a friend saw her near a neighborhood store. Mary said she was heading home. She never arrived. Her father waited. By 10:30 that night, he called the police and reported her missing. At first, officers did not treat the disappearance as an emergency. Mary was 12. She could have been visiting a friend or stopped somewhere along the way. But police began searching the following day. They checked several empty buildings. They spoke with Mary's friends. And they contacted the district attorney. Something about the disappearance was not adding up. Still, there was no clear evidence that Mary had been taken. For the next 2 days, investigators searched for her as a missing girl. Her father kept asking for answers. The police kept searching. And Mary was nowhere to be found. Then March 18th arrived. 3 days had passed since anyone had seen her. The investigation changed. Police began searching vacant houses, abandoned buildings, junkyards, and other places where someone could have been taken or hidden. Other police departments across New York and into Pennsylvania were notified. The possibility that Mary had simply wandered away was becoming harder to believe. She had left that Sunday evening expecting to go home. Now, 3 days later, she was still missing, and investigators had no solid lead on where she was. 4 days after Mary disappeared, they found her. It was March 19, 1964. A man was hiking near Combs Hill Road in Southport with his 2 sons when they came across something in the woods. It was Mary. She was still fully clothed. Her body had been covered with dirt, branches, and large stones. Her mouth had been stuffed with dirt and twigs. There was no longer any question that this was a missing person case. Mary had been murdered. The medical examiner determined that she had been strangled. There was also evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. Investigators believe she had been killed in or near the area where her body was found. That mattered. Mary had last been seen walking home in Elmira. 4 days later, she was dead in the woods near Combs Hill Road. The investigation now had a crime scene, and police had to work backward from it. They searched vacant houses and abandoned buildings. They checked junkyards and other locations where Mary might have been taken. Police departments across New York and into Pennsylvania were alerted. But none of it produced the answer they needed. Who had taken Mary? Who had brought her into those woods? And who had left her there beneath the dirt, branches, and stones? For Mary's family, the search had ended in the worst possible way. Her father had spent 4 days waiting for his daughter to come home. Now he knew she never would. And in the days that followed, people in Elmira began learning more about the girl they had lost. People who knew Mary described her as quiet and shy. She was 12 years old. She had only recently returned to Elmira with her father after living in Hammondsport. Now her name was in the newspapers, and her murder was one of the biggest stories in the area. But the investigation faced a problem that would define the case for decades. Police had Mary's body. They had the crime scene. They had an autopsy. They had evidence. What they did not have was a name. The investigation was massive. By October 1964, police had interviewed more than 300 people. They followed leads across state lines. They questioned people who had been near Mary before she disappeared. They searched for anyone who might have seen her that evening. But no interview produced the name they needed. No arrest followed. The case received heavy attention in the local press. The Elmira Star-Gazette and WELM Radio offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to Mary's killer. The message was simple. Someone knew something. Police just needed that person to come forward. No one did. The months passed, then the years. The 1960s became the 1970s. The 1970s became the 1980s. And the investigation gradually lost momentum. The detectives who had worked Mary's murder grew older, some retired, some died. The people they had interviewed moved away, memories faded. Leads that once seemed promising went nowhere. And the technology that would eventually change the case did not exist yet. In 1964, investigators could collect physical evidence. They could preserve clothing. They could take photographs. They could interview witnesses and compare statements, but they could not take a microscopic biological sample from a crime scene and search a database for the person who left it. So the case remained open, but it stopped moving. For decades, Mary Theresa Simpson remained one of Elmira's oldest unsolved homicides. Her family grew older without an answer. The investigators who had spent years looking for her killer eventually left the case behind. But the evidence did not leave with them. It remained preserved. And that mattered. Because decades later, the case attracted a new generation of investigators and researchers. In 2025, author Christina Finelli published a book examining Mary's murder and the investigation surrounding it. She worked closely with Mary's older sister, Linda Galpin, to verify details of the family's story. The book was another reminder that Mary had not been forgotten. But public memory could not identify her killer. The answer had to come from somewhere else. And all those years, inside the evidence collected in 1964, investigators still had something they had not been able to use. Something the original detectives had preserved without knowing just how important it would become. A piece of evidence that had waited 60 years for the science to catch up with it. For decades, investigators had almost nothing to work with. Then they found something. In 2003, nearly 40 years after Mary's murder, investigators with the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center went back through the evidence. Among the clothing preserved from the case was Mary's skirt. Testing found semen, and inside that biological evidence was something investigators in 1964 could never have used: DNA. The evidence had been collected before DNA testing became a standard tool in criminal investigations. Now, nearly 4 decades later, scientists were able to develop a DNA profile from it. For the first time, investigators had something that could potentially identify the man who had killed Mary. They entered the profile into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. Then they waited for a match. Nothing. No known offender matched the profile. That didn't mean the DNA was wrong. It meant the person who left it had not been identified through the database. So the case remained open. In 2014, investigators tried again. The DNA profile was submitted to CODIS once more. Still nothing. And that exposed the central problem. CODIS could only help if the killer's DNA was already in the system. If he had never been arrested for a crime that resulted in a DNA sample, there was nothing for investigators to match. The profile could tell them that the same unknown man had left biological evidence behind. But it could not tell them his name. For the first time, investigators had the most important piece of evidence they could have hoped for. They knew the killer had left DNA. They just had no idea who it belonged to. And for years, that was where the case stopped. The DNA profile remained. The killer's identity did not. But forensic science was changing again. And the next breakthrough would not come from finding the killer in a criminal database. It would come from looking for his family. In 2022, the case had been cold for decades. But Sergeant William Goodwin of the Elmira Police Department wasn't ready to leave it there. He applied for funding through Season of Justice, a non-profit that supports cold case investigations. The grant was approved. Now investigators could try something that hadn't been possible when the case was first investigated. They could send the old DNA evidence to a laboratory that specialized in working with difficult forensic samples. The laboratory was Othram, in Texas. And the amount of DNA they had to work with was almost unbelievably small. Just 0.4 nanograms. It was too small to see. But it was still enough to try. FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen helped get the sample to Othram. The question was no longer whether Mary's killer had left DNA behind. They already knew he had. The question was whether modern technology could turn that tiny sample into something investigators could actually use. Othram was able to develop a forensic DNA profile from the evidence. And that opened a door that had not existed in 1964. Or even in 2003. Or in 2014. Genetic genealogy. The basic idea was different from a traditional DNA database search. CODIS looks for the person whose DNA matches the evidence. Genetic genealogy can work another way. It can find relatives. A DNA profile from an unknown person can be compared with genetic information in public genealogy databases. A match might not identify the killer himself. It might identify someone related to him. Then investigators can work backward through the family. Parents, siblings, children, cousins. Generations of relatives. Until the family tree narrows the possibilities. That was the approach investigators now had available. But it was not a matter of entering Mary's DNA into a website and getting a name. It took months of work. In 2023, Elmira investigators also began working with the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College. Students helped organize and digitize more than 6,000 pages of records collected over decades. They reviewed the old investigation. They mapped Mary's movements. They returned to the area where her body had been found. They even examined the rocks that had been used to cover her. At the same time, the FBI was working with the DNA profile to build a family tree. The process slowly narrowed the possibilities. Investigators began contacting people connected to the family. And eventually, the investigation pointed toward a man from Elmira. Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. Murray had died in 2004. He had never been identified as a suspect during the original investigation. His name had not been sitting in the case files as the obvious answer. It had been found through the DNA. But investigators still needed more. A genealogy lead is not the same thing as proving that a particular person left biological evidence at a crime scene. So investigators obtained a DNA sample from one of Murray's sons. The results supported the family connection. Now investigators had a much stronger lead, but Murray was dead. They couldn't ask him for a sample. They couldn't question him about Mary. And they couldn't simply declare the case solved because his name appeared at the end of a family tree. They needed his DNA, directly. That meant going to court and asking for permission to exhume his remains. On November 4, 2025, investigators opened Murray's grave. They recovered a sample from his remains. Then they compared it with the DNA recovered from the evidence in Mary's case. This time, there was no family tree to interpret. No distant relative to trace. No database lead to follow. It was a direct comparison. The result was extraordinary. The probability of an unrelated person producing the same DNA result was less than 1 in 320 billion. After 61 years, investigators finally had the answer. The DNA from Mary's case pointed to Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. The tiny piece of evidence preserved from a 12-year-old girl's murder had survived long enough for the science to catch up with it. And the man it ultimately identified had been dead for more than 2 decades. The case had finally reached its answer. But there was still one question investigators could not answer. Why Mary? So who was Alfred Raymond Murray Jr.? He was born in Elmira in 1931. He served in the U.S. Army during the Korean War. Later, he worked as a truck driver and raised a family in the same community where Mary had lived. By all outward appearances, he had built an ordinary life. There was no obvious connection between him and Mary Theresa Simpson. Investigators looked for one. They found no known relationship between Murray and Mary, and no evidence that he had any connection to her family. As far as investigators could determine, Mary and Murray were strangers. That matters because it changes the way the murder looks. There was no known dispute between them. No documented relationship. No known reason for Murray to have been looking for Mary. The evidence instead pointed toward a chance encounter. Murray was also not among the people investigators identified as suspects in 1964. His name was not part of the original investigation. It would take more than 6 decades, and a DNA investigation that could not have been performed when Mary was killed, before investigators connected him to the case. There was another part of Murray's history that investigators examined. According to Sergeant William Goodwin, Murray had a criminal record that included offenses involving children. That history did not prove that he killed Mary, but investigators said it was consistent with the forensic evidence and the circumstances of the homicide, and that distinction matters. The DNA evidence was what connected Murray to the crime scene. His criminal history was additional context. It was not the evidence that identified him. By the time investigators reached him, Murray had already been dead for more than 20 years. He had never been arrested for Mary's murder. He had never faced a courtroom over it. He could not be questioned about what happened on March 15, 1964. There would be no confession, no explanation. No opportunity to hear his account of what happened that night. There was only the evidence that had survived him. And that leaves one of the most unsettling facts about this case. The person investigators eventually identified had spent decades living an ordinary life in the same city where Mary had lived. For 61 years his name and Mary's remained completely separate in the investigation. Then a piece of biological evidence changed that. The DNA did not tell investigators why Murray encountered Mary. It did not tell them what he was thinking. And it could not explain what happened in those final moments. It answered one question. Who left the DNA? After 61 years, investigators finally knew. What they could never recover was the answer to the question that came next. Why? On February 10, 2026, the Elmira Police Department gathered at the Chimong County District Attorney's Office. After 61 years, they were ready to close Mary Theresa Simpson's case. Police Chief Kristen Thorne announced that investigators had identified Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. as the person responsible for the DNA recovered from Mary's clothing. Murray was already dead. He had died in 2004, more than 20 years before investigators connected him to the murder. So there would be no arrest, no trial, no jury, no sentence. If Murray had been alive, Chief Thorne said, prosecutors would have sought murder charges against him. But that was impossible now. The evidence had to speak for itself. And it did. The DNA comparison between Murray's remains and the evidence from Mary's case produced a result with a reported probability of less than 1 in 320 billion for an unrelated person. After more than 6 decades, investigators finally had a name. But the person who mattered most was not standing behind the podium. She was sitting in the room. Linda Galpin, Mary's older sister. Linda had been 16 when Mary was murdered. She was 78 when the case was finally closed. For most of her life, she had carried the memory of her little sister without knowing who had killed her. She had also carried the memory of Mary's funeral. Linda later recalled seeing her sister in the casket and trying to climb inside it. She had wanted to be with Mary. That memory stayed with her for 61 years. Now, for the first time, there was a name attached to the question that had followed her family for most of her life. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. The answer had not come through an arrest. It had not come through a confession. It had not come from a witness suddenly remembering what they had seen in 1964. It came from evidence that police had preserved for decades. A biological trace left behind when Mary was 12. A DNA profile created years later. A family connection investigators could follow. And finally, DNA taken directly from the remains of a man who had been dead since 2004. The technology changed. The investigators changed. The years passed, but the evidence remained. And because it remained, Mary's case did not disappear completely. Her family still had questions. Now they had an answer to the biggest one. Who killed Mary Theresa Simpson? After 61 years, investigators believed they knew. But there was something no laboratory could recover. What Mary experienced during those final moments. What Murray was thinking. Why he chose her. And what might have happened if that tiny piece of evidence had never survived. Those questions may never be answered. But one question that had haunted the Simpson family since 1964 finally was. Mary Theresa Simpson was no longer an unidentified victim in an unsolved case. Her name had an answer attached to it. And after 61 years, the case was closed. For 61 years, Mary Theresa Simpson's murder had a question attached to it. Who killed her? The answer did not come from a confession. It did not come from a witness suddenly remembering what happened. And it did not come from an investigator finally finding the right suspect in an old case file. It came from evidence collected in 1964. Evidence that was preserved long enough for science to make sense of it. When Mary's clothing was collected, no investigator could have known what DNA testing would become. They could not have known that decades later, scientists would be able to build a profile from biological evidence that had been sitting in police custody for years. They could not have known that genetic genealogy would eventually give investigators another way to search for an unknown person. They only knew that the evidence mattered, so it was kept. And 61 years later, it mattered again. Mary was 12 years old when she died. She had a mother and father, she had siblings. She had an older sister, Linda, who was 16 when Mary was killed, and who lived for decades without knowing who had taken her little sister's life. In 2026, Linda finally heard the name investigators had been searching for since 1964. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. There was no trial, no conviction, no sentence. Murray had been dead since 2004, but the DNA evidence gave investigators an answer they had spent more than half a century trying to find. And that is what makes this case important beyond the name of the man investigators identified. Cold cases depend on what survives. Evidence. Records, photographs. Clothing. Witness statements. Sometimes, the technology needed to understand those things does not exist yet. Sometimes it takes years before anyone knows exactly what they are looking at. That does not mean the evidence has stopped mattering. It may simply mean that the right method has not arrived yet. Mary's case began in 1964. The technology that eventually helped identify the person responsible came decades later. The investigation changed. The detectives changed, the science changed, but the evidence remained. And because it remained, 61 years later, it could finally speak, not about everything. It cannot tell us what Mary was thinking that night. It cannot tell us why Murray encountered her. It cannot give her family every answer they may still wish they had. But it answered the question that had remained unanswered for most of Linda Galpin's life. Who killed Mary Theresa Simpson? After 61 years, investigators had an answer. Mary's name had finally been separated from the word unsolved. And that answer began with something investigators had preserved in 1964. Something so small that nobody could have known how important it would become. Until 61 years later,